Let's bring in MS Now's Vaughn Hilliard from the White House. MS Now's Inez de la Cuetara live from Davos. And MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde. Also with us, author of the Need to Know Substack and Daily Beast columnist David Rothkopf. Vaughn, President Trump really creating quite a stir and making some news there. Talk to us about how he tried to make the case for the U.S. to acquire Greenland.
Right, Anna. I think that we need to be very clear at this moment in time what the backdrop was to these remarks from the President of the United States in Switzerland. And that was that less than 24 hours ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, effectively speaking for a great number of European countries, was very explicit about the threat that the United States president was posing to European countries. He said yesterday, we're shifting to a world without rules. Imperial ambitions are resurfacing, in which unacceptable tariffs are being used as leverage against territorial sovereignty, and that Trump wants to openly aim to weaken and subordinate Europe. That comes just days after President Trump threatened to impose new tariffs on each of those countries, including Europe and Denmark, I should say France and Denmark, unless they push for Denmark to agree to the selling of Greenland to the United States. And so while it is notable that President Trump there in Davos said that he does not intend to use force, he also made it very clear that it would be overwhelming force and that the U.S. could easily take it and that there would be little resistance. It was that sort of a threat that, of course, European allies, longtime European allies of the United States, are clearly in tune to, because President Trump has made his objective very clear. He has continued to post also about acquiring Canada. He has called himself the acting president of Venezuela. So his expansionist ideations have been made very clear to Europe. And the president of the United States made it clear that he and the United States effectively are boosting the economies of these European countries, and that if they were to forego cooperating with the United States, their economies would consequently suffer.
Inez, I'm curious if there's any international response so far to the Trump's remarks. I know it's early, but what is the tone? What are you hearing?
Yeah, and I will wait to get specific statements from different countries. But I think overall there's a sense that the president's arguments are not holding up here. So he continues to insist that he needs Greenland for national security reasons. And yet it was just last week that the Danes and European allies announced they would be sending in reinforcements to Greenland, additional troops, additional resources to bolster security both in Greenland and around the Arctic. And the president's response was to threaten to slap 10% tariffs on those countries. So I think people don't understand what he's trying to do. Beyond that, you know, Anna, I was just in Greenland last week. We were talking about this. I repeatedly spoke to Greenlandic officials who told me there is no evidence of an immediate Russian threat from Russia or China, telling me that they had not seen evidence of Russian and Chinese ships in Greenlandic waters, as the president has claimed. I even spoke to a Danish naval officer who told me that in his 30-plus years of working in and around Greenland, he had never seen a Chinese or a Russian ship. So I think there's confusion in terms of what the president's argument is here. People just don't understand what he's trying to do. And one more point I'll make, just coming back from my trip from Greenland, speaking to people there, when you hear the president talking about how Greenland is just a piece of ice, that is something that's going to be deeply offensive to people there. Greenland is home to Greenlanders who are, the population there is a vast majority of them are Inuit. They are very proud. They have a very rich history and culture. It is much more than just a piece of ice to them. So that's something to watch, as well as the reaction coming from Greenlanders, Anna.
Yeah, Vaughn, you touched on some of the remarks we heard from world leaders ahead of the president's speech. In fact, it was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney who got a standing ovation when he talked about a rupture, not a transition underway, and also went on to say that there's a strong tendency for countries to sort of just go along, that it's the easier route to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety, he said. It won't. French President Macron also criticizing the president's take on Greenland and handling of allies. And the president called them out in his speech. What did he say directly about Mark Carney and Macron?
Right, Anna. Over the course of the last year, since the president's inauguration, we have seen a posture of appeasement by European countries largely towards President Trump. There have been agreements of trade deals that have been announced in order to try to bring down the temperature and take a certain level of tariff rate as opposed to exceedingly high tariff rates. And yet what we saw yesterday from President Macron of France and then Prime Minister Carney of Canada was essentially calling on European allies of the United States to understand, in the words of Mark Carney, that there is a rupture of the world order and that this was not a slow transition, but this was happening at an accelerated rate. It was Carney that said there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. It won't. These threats to overtake Greenland and Canada have really spurred a response from the United States, some of their closest partners and allies. And then with the president going before this crowd in Davos, this is how he responded to the Canadian Prime Minister. Take a listen.
We're building a Golden Dome that's going to, just by its very nature, going to be defending Canada. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
There was a bravado from the president of the United States there in Europe here today, in which he said the United States is keeping the whole world afloat. Not only was he saying that Canada couldn't live without the United States, he was standing there delivering the speech in Switzerland, and he referred to a conversation he said that he had last year with the female prime minister of Switzerland. We should be clear, there is no prime minister of Switzerland. There is a president of the Swiss Federation, in which he said very explicitly that talking about Switzerland, that, quote, they're only good because of us. And when he went back to World War II, he told that crowd that without us, you'd only be speaking German or a little Japanese, perhaps. The president of the United States very dismissive of the close partners and allies of the United States that have held this current global order really together, dating back to post-World War II construction.
David Rothkopf, I want to listen to another reason the president laid out for why the U.S. should essentially be given Greenland. Let's listen.
We saved Greenland and successfully prevented our enemies from gaining a foothold in our hemisphere. So we did it for ourselves also. After the war, we gave Greenland back to Denmark. How stupid were we to do that? But we did it. But we gave it back. But how ungrateful are they now?
David, if you are the Danes or Greenlandic officials, what are you thinking?
Well, I think you're angry. I don't think you see what the president is displaying here as bravado. You see it as arrogance. You see it as bullying. You see it as the behavior of an aggressor, much akin to the behavior that you've seen from Russia in Ukraine. I think today was a fiasco. I think this visit to Davos so far has been a fiasco. People walked out on Howard Lutnick last night at an event. There was great, and I've talked to people in Davos recently and just after the president's remarks, and there was real unhappiness with what they heard. They felt he was rude and ignorant and offensive. But I have to say, more important than that, this is a watershed in history. What we are watching is the breakdown of an Atlantic alliance that has been the foundation of international peace for the past 80 years. You don't get over the kind of insults he's offered to the Danes or the Canadians or the British or the French or anyone in Europe. And that's where we are. I do not think we are going to go back to the kind of Atlantic alliance that we have had, at least until Trump is gone, but possibly for a long time after that, as Europeans look with skepticism on the stability of the U.S. system that could produce an extremist who has such contempt for the international system as Donald Trump.
David Rothkopf, I mean, I keep thinking, did these remarks accomplish anything for President Trump?
No, I don't think that they did. He did not make a compelling case for the Greenland acquisition because there is no compelling case to be made. But he offended allies. He makes it more likely that they're going to stand up to him. I think he subliminally sent a message to them was that their toughness recently has got him backing off a little bit on the threat to use force. And this is Taco Trump, again, backing off when somebody stands up to him. But I think he's also sent a message that he is tone deaf, that he is oblivious to history. Woven into his remarks were other troubling dimensions. He attacked the Somalis in the most racist possible way. And they also know when they hear that this is a guy who is sending troops into the streets in the United States, that we are not the pillar of NATO that we have been for 80 years, that we are now a threat to Europe. And that's what people are walking out of the room thinking.
So, David Rohde, if you're European officials, are you reconsidering your security plans?
Yes, and you're reconsidering your political plans, because all these countries and I agree that President Trump was denigrating, Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, are democracies. And the European press coverage is already deeply negative of President Trump. It will be even more so after this kind of speech. It was insult after insult. We won World War II. Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers died fighting World War II. Hundreds of thousands of French. The Canadians stormed the beaches of Normandy alongside U.S. troops. So these are political leaders who are going to have to stand up to Trump just to survive politically. And so I think this was a failure, the speech itself, and I think it's just going to turn European public opinion and therefore elected European leaders against the United States.